Strangely enough, they have had a mind to till the soil, and the love of possessions is a disease in them. They claim this mother of ours, the earth, for their own use, and fence their neighbors away from her and deface her with their buildings and their refuse. These people have made many rules that the rich may break, but the poor may not. The white men had many things we wanted. We could see they did not have the one thing we liked best. Freedom. My brothers, shall we submit, or shall we say to them, first kill me before you can take possession of my fatherland?
The White House will resume efforts to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill.
Governor Gavin Newsom apologized to California Native Americans on California's behalf for the violence and genocide during the 19th century and beyond. Historians are questioning Donald Trump's comments on Andrew Jackson, while critics are asking for answers on why Donald Trump chose to hang Jackson's portrait in the Oval Office.
When it comes to American history, no other period has defined our culture, fortified our systems, and continues to influence the values of our nation today as much as the 19th century did. From early Hollywood westerns to Civil War reenactments, American heroism is celebrated. But at the same time, the struggle to come to terms with the ugly legacy of slavery and prejudice is arduous. This documentary will take you on a journey to hear from some of the most impactful voices as echoes from the 19th century. Consequences of the Indian Removal Act, Part 1. At the beginning of the 19th century, the United States had its eyes on expansion after achieving independence 24 years earlier in the bloody Revolutionary War. In the year 1800, there were 16 states in this newly united country, and by the turn of the 20th century, there were 45 states in total, spanning from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. Not only was this land being acquired on a national level, but land within each state was also being taken by a legal system that favored Americans of European heritage over Native Americans. Lawyers dealt out claims of land that were once protected by treaties. This displaced large populations of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, and other local tribes. One lawyer who was actively working to replace the Native Americans with white Americans for land usage was a Revolutionary War veteran, a politician, the founder of Memphis, Tennessee, and a brutal plantation owner, Andrew Jackson. In addition to land grabbing legally through the Land Grab Act, in 1813, Jackson had led a militia of soldiers against the Creek tribes, which upon victory led to the Treaty of Fort Jackson. This treaty called for the acquisition of 23 million acres of land in Georgia and Alabama. A controversial politician in his time, Andrew Jackson had been known to strongly oppose Native American rights, and he was also known to be the brutal plantation owner of the Hermitage Plantation. At one time, Jackson had even posted flyers offering a bounty which included an additional $10 per every 100 lashes inflicted during the capture and return. Despite the many outspoken criticisms, and after a failed presidential run in 1824, Andrew Jackson eventually became the 7th President of the United States of America. In 1830, Andrew Jackson had signed the Indian Removal Act and gave this address to Congress.
It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years, in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation. 2 important tribes have accepted the provision made for their removal at the last session of Congress, and it is believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes also to seek the same obvious advantages. The consequences of a speedy removal will be important to the United States, to individual states, and to the Indians themselves. The pecuniary advantages which it promises to the government are the least of its recommendations. It puts an end to all possible danger of collision between the authorities of the general and state governments on account of the Indians. It will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of country now occupied by a few savage hunters. By opening the whole territory between Tennessee on the north and Louisiana on the south to the settlement of the whites, it will incalculably strengthen the southwestern frontier and render the adjacent states strong enough to repel future invasions without remote aid. It will relieve the whole state of Mississippi and the western part of Alabama of Indian occupancy, and enable those states to advance rapidly in population, wealth, and power. It will separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites, free them from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way and under their own rude institutions, will retard the progress of decay, which is lessening their numbers, and perhaps cause them gradually, under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsels, to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. The present policy of the government is but a continuation of the same progressive change by a milder process. The tribes which occupied the countries now constituting the eastern states were annihilated or have melted away to make room for the whites. The waves of population and civilization are rolling to the westward, and we now propose to acquire the countries occupied by the red men of the South and West by a fair exchange, and at the expense of the United States, to send them to land where their existence may be prolonged and perhaps made perpetual. Doubtless it will be painful to leave the graves of their fathers. But what do they, more than our ancestors did, or than our children are now doing? To better their condition in an unknown land, our forefathers left all that was dear in earthly objects. Our children, by thousands yearly, leave the land of their birth to seek new homes in distant regions. Does humanity weep at these painful separations from everything, animate and inanimate, with which the young heart has become entwined? Far from it. It is rather a source of joy that our country affords scope where our young population may range unconstrained in body or in mind, developing the power and facilities of man in their highest perfection. These remove hundreds and almost thousands of miles at their own expense, purchase the lands they occupy, and support themselves at their new homes from the moment of their arrival. Can it be cruel in this government when, by events which it cannot control, the Indian is made discontented in his ancient home to purchase his lands, to give him a new and extensive territory, to pay the expense of his removal, and support him a year in his new abode? How many thousands of our own people would gladly embrace the opportunity of removing to the West on such conditions? If the offers made to the Indians were extended to them, they would be hailed with gratitude and joy. And is it supposed that the wandering savage has a stronger attachment to his home than the settled, civilized Christian? Is it more afflicting to him to leave the graves of his fathers than it is to our brothers and children? Rightly considered, the policy of the general government toward the red man is not only liberal, but generous. He is unwilling to submit to the laws of the states and mingle with their population. To save him from this alternative, or perhaps utter annihilation, the general government kindly offers him a new home and proposes to pay the whole expense of his removal and settlement.
The aftermath of this address and the signing of the Indian Removal Act led to the grabbing of over 25 million acres of land by white settlers and the displacement of more than 46,000 Native Americans by the United States cavalries. This displacement by force took away property, land, and dignity, and often resulted in death. The mass forced removal became known as the Trail of Tears and spanned over 2 decades. While many Americans of European heritage took advantage of this opportunity for a stake in the land, the public outrage against Andrew Jackson was also building. Famous frontiersman and Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett publicly threatened to leave the United States over the forced removals. Another outspoken activist against the Indian Removal Act was a Christian missionary named Jeremiah Everts. Although unsuccessful in his attempts to stop the forced removals, Jeremiah Everts' work was inspiring and echoed throughout the abolitionist movement and others. Chief John Ross of the Cherokee Nation was also a prominent opponent of the Indian Removal Act. John Ross was born to a Scottish father and a Cherokee mother and experienced a mixed cultural upbringing. As John Ross was fluent in English, he became an advocate for the territorial rights of Native Americans and was called the Moses of his people. At the time, the Cherokee Nation also had internal turmoil, as some of them, including Chief John Ross, participated in the enslavement of peoples of African descent. Because of the use of enslaved people and the openness to Christianity, Americans named the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole tribes the 5 civilized tribes. This shows the erroneous definition of the word civilized during this period, as often the negated word was also used to degrade lifestyles and to justify actions against the Native Americans. Despite the civilized title, the 5 tribes were included in the forced removal, along with 12 other tribes, and the native-ran farms along with the land used for the tribe's traditional living were seized by the government for white settlers to obtain. Chief John Ross sent this letter to the Senate and House of Representatives regarding the Indian Removal Act.
By the stipulations of this instrument, we are despoiled of our private possessions, the indefeasible property of individuals. We are stripped of every attribute of freedom and eligibility for legal self-defense. Our property may be plundered before our eyes. Violence may be committed against our persons. Even our lives may be taken away. And there is none to regard our complaints. We are denationalized. We are disenfranchised. We are deprived of membership in the human family. We have neither land nor home, no resting place that could be called our own. And this is affected by the provisions of a compact which assumes the venerated, the sacred appellation of treaty. We are overwhelmed. Our hearts are sickened. Our utterance is paralyzed when we reflect on the condition in which we are placed by the audacious practices of unprincipled men who have managed their stratagems with so much dexterity as to impose on the government of the United States, in the face of our earnest, solemn, and reiterated protestations. The instrument in question is not the act of our nation. We are not parties to its covenants. It has not received the sanction of our people. The makers of it sustain no office nor appointment in our nation under the designation of chiefs, headmen, or any other title by which they hold or could acquire the authority to assume the reins of government and to make bargain and sale of our rights, our possessions, and our common country. And we are constrained solemnly to declare that we cannot but contemplate the enforcement of the stipulations of this instrument on us, against our consent, as an act of injustice and oppression which, we are well persuaded, can never knowingly be countenanced by the government and people of the United States. Nor can we believe it to be the design of these honorable and high-minded individuals who stand at the head of the government to bind a whole nation by the acts of a few unauthorized individuals. And therefore we, the parties to be affected by the result, appeal with confidence to the justice, the magnanimity, the compassion of your honorable bodies against the enforcement on us of the provisions of a compact in the formation of which we have had no agency.
Over the next 2 decades, the Trail of Tears was edging towards genocide. The United States cavalries executed various attacks on the 17 tribes during their trek on the 1,000-mile-long route. 1 in 5 of the displaced people is said to not have made it to the new territory. As this was happening, another mass migration was taking place, although this one was voluntary. In large numbers, Americans were heading to the western frontier. In 1848, gold was struck in Northern California, and the gold rush was on in full force. People from all over the world were heading to California to strike it rich in gold. As the Americans came into gold country, they were finding Mexicans, Native Americans, Chinese, and African Americans also panning for gold. The blatant intolerance for these other cultures resulted in the foreign miners tax, where non-white and non-American gold seekers were taxed so high that they would not be able to participate in the mining. Perhaps no other group received the brunt of the newly American California as the Native Americans did. Absolute brutality was given to the local tribes of California, and an estimated 100,000 Native Americans were murdered in the first 2 years of the gold rush. This was a state-sponsored effort to, in some cases, enslave, and in other cases, eradicate the native peoples. In 1849, Peter Burnett was the first elected governor of California. This is an excerpt from his executive order.
Our American experience has demonstrated the fact that the two races cannot live in the same vicinity in peace, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct,
must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. Our Constitution excludes this class of person from the right of suffrage and from all offices of honor or profit under the state, and our laws exclude them from serving on juries and from appearing as witnesses against a white man. Although it is assumed in the Declaration of Independence as a self-evident truth that all men are born free and equal, it is equally true that there must be acquired as well as natural abilities to fit men for self-government.
Along with the state-sponsored bounties on Native American scalps and the massacring by the American forces, the enslavement of Native Americans also occurred in California during this period. Benjamin Kelsey, his brother Andrew Kelsey, and Charles Stone captured over 100 people of the Pomo tribe of the Sonoma and Lake counties. They treated the Pomo peoples brutally, often overworking, beating, and killing them. In desperation on the Kelsey property, one night the enslaved Pomos rushed and killed Andrew Kelsey and Charles Stone upon escaping. When Benjamin Kelsey found his brother's dead body, he assembled a death squad and was able to kill 20 Pomo before being stopped by his neighbors. The remaining Pomo had escaped to Bonopoti Island in Clear Lake and were hunted down by the 1st Dragoons Regiment of the United States Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Nathaniel Leone and Lieutenant J.W. Davidson. By mixed accounts of the massacre, the cavalry murdered anywhere between 60 to 400 people of the Pomo tribe, including women and children. This atrocity is known as the Bloody Island Massacre and is one of over 30 known massacres carried out by the Americans in California during this period. Throughout the rest of the 19th century, the Native American populations in the United States continued to face forced removals, forced enrollment in re-education boarding schools, and genocide. The Native American population at the start of the 19th century was estimated at around 600,000, and by 1899 it was estimated at around 237,000. This dramatic population decline was due to systematic genocide by the means of murder and the control of the food supply. In the 1870s, the United States Army, along with hired hunters, went so far as to kill any buffalo in sight in order to starve the Native Americans. President Ulysses S. Grant approved of the killing of the buffalo and saw it as an opportunity to kill off the remaining Native Americans trying to survive.
Is the year 1870, and the great American plains offer a vast open region for a new tide of settlement. With few streams and little water, the plains are nonetheless rich in deep, fertile soil. And there is room here, room for a man to farm, room to carve out a new life, room to breathe. And now it is the western plains that beckon. Once it was the pack horse, later the flatboat. Now it is oxen and wagons that carry the pioneers west. The father bought a Tippecanoe. The son was with Meade at Gettysburg. The mother confronted forest trails. The daughter faces the lonely plains. The American faith travels westward in the prairie skirt. There are pauses in the journey. Each night, pioneers and oxen must have rest and food and water. Strangers in all but their sharing of a common heritage and a common destiny. Yes, it is good to be with one's own kind again.
The Abolitionist Movement, Part 2.
Anytime while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it. Just to stand 1 minute on God's earth, a free woman, I would.
The transatlantic trafficking and trading of enslaved peoples and the horrific subjugation of life on southern plantations stained the nation with a legacy so brutal and sickening that the ramifications are still haunting to this day. Prior to the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, prominent anti-slavery figures in the abolitionist movement sacrificed everything, including their own lives, to end slavery once and for all. One man that organized the freeing of enslaved peoples by any means was the legendary hero John Brown. A man of strong convictions, John Brown believed he was an instrument of God to end American slavery, even if it meant doing so with violent tactics. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, which meant that the formerly enslaved peoples who had escaped the free states could be charged and returned to their abusers in the South. In response to this, John Brown began bringing those who he had rescued to Canada to ensure their freedom was permanent. John Brown was willing to go so far as to kill pro-slavery forces, and did so in various skirmishes during this period. Frustrated by the lack of results from pacifist tactics in the abolitionist movement, John Brown was ready to act and was planning to raid the Harper's Ferry Armory in Virginia. John Brown and his 22 men were met with resistance by the United States Marines, including Robert E. Lee, and it ended with John Brown's men killing 4 and losing 10. John Brown was arrested, tried, and hung immediately after. This is an excerpt from John Brown's last speech in court.
In the first place, I deny everything but what I have all along admitted. The design on my part to free the slaves. I intended, certainly, to have made a clean thing of that matter, as I did last winter when I went into Missouri, and there took slaves without the snapping of a gun on either side, moved them through the country, and finally left them in Canada. I designed to have done the same thing again on a larger scale. That was all I intended. I never did intend murder, or treason, or the destruction of property, or to excite or incite slaves to rebellion, or to make insurrection. I have another objection, and that is, it is unjust that I should suffer such a penalty. Had I interfered in the manner which I admit, and which I admit has been fairly proved, for I admire the truthfulness and candor of the greater portion of the witnesses who have testified in this case. Had I so interfered, in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward, rather than punishment.
Another activist for the freeing of enslaved peoples and a woman who was willing to risk it all was the great Harriet Tubman. Tubman was born into enslavement and eventually escaped with her brother. Harriet Tubman made it her mission to rescue slaves and bring them into Canada, where slavery was abolished. In what is called the Underground Railroad, Tubman rescued around 70 enslaved people and brought them to safety during 13 expeditions. In 1858, Harriet Tubman met John Brown. They had in common the calling from God to directly free the people, although she did not advocate for using such violence as John Brown did. Tubman aided in the planning of the Harper's Ferry attack, but did not partake. Author Sarah H. Bradford was a good friend to Harriet Tubman and wrote books about her life and expeditions. This is an excerpt from her book, Harriet, the Moses of Her People.
And then she enters the recesses of the woods, carrying hope and comfort to the anxious watchers there. One by one, they steal out from their hiding places and are fed and strengthened for another night's journey. And so by night travel, by signals, by threatenings, by encouragement through watchings and fastings, and may I say by direct interpositions of providence and miraculous deliverances, she brought her people to what was then their land of Canaan, the state of New York. But alas, this state did not continue to be their refuge. For in 1850, I think, the fugitive slave law was put in force, which bound the people north of the Mason-Dixon line to return to bondage any fugitive found in their territories. After that, said Harriet, I wouldn't trust Uncle Sam with my people no longer, but I brought 'em all clear off to Canada.
Harriet Tubman went on to work for the Union Army during the Civil War as a scout and a spy, and in her later life became an activist for women's suffrage. Another person who was born into enslavement and was able to escape and become a leader in the abolitionist movement was the intellectual Frederick Douglass. Douglass sought to open the dialogue and present the moral opposition to slavery through the means of education. A highly successful author and orator in the 19th century, Frederick Douglass shattered the bad faith misconceptions about African Americans and was rightfully recognized as one of the great thinkers of this period. He even warned John Brown that the Harper's Ferry raid would be a suicide mission. Frederick Douglass also believed that photography would be a way to end slavery by showing the horrific details that many Americans preferred to be ignorant of. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century. When Frederick Douglass was invited to speak at an abolitionist event celebrating the 4th of July, he had this to say.
Fellow citizens, pardon me and allow me to ask, why am I called to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to those questions. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delightful. For who is there so cold that a nation's sympathy cannot warm him? Who so adored and dead to the claims of gratitude that would not thankfully acknowledge such priceless benefits? Who so stolid and selfish that would not give his voice to swell the hallelujahs of a nation's jubilee when the chains of servitude have been torn from his limbs? I am not that man. In a case like that, the dumb might eloquently speak, and the lame man leap as an hart, but such is not the case. I say it with a sad sense of disparity between us. I am not included within the pales of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct. And let me warn you that it is dangerous to copy the example of a nation, Babylon, whose crimes towering up to heaven were thrown down by the breath of the Almighty, burying that nation in irrecoverable ruin. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains heavy and grievous, yesterday or today rendered more intolerable by the jubilant shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not remember those bleeding children of sorrow this day, may my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with popular theme would be treason, most sacrilegious and shocking, and would make me a reproach before God and the world. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view. Standing here, identified with the American bondsman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present. The conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting.
The political divide and controversy around the nation's past can seem contemporary, but a discourse of fiery disagreements throughout the 19th century was commonplace. The voices of the disenfranchised and those that ruled with power back then continue to echo through campaigns, elections, and the protests in our present day. From speaking out against the forced displacement of Native Americans to the abolitionist movement, the American people have had a strong opposition to oppression during the nation's darkest times. The 19th century in the United States of America was a collision between those who furthered the perils of the past and those who gave their lives for freedom, equality, and a better life for all. The voices and actions from this period will continue to echo as we grab the torch and pursue true justice and liberty for all.